Indeed, I was about to say we do have quorum, and it's 3 minutes past when we said we'd resume, so we're going to resume. The next item, Ms. Legault.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item R3 is a report from the Environmental Services Division regarding groundwater monitoring of nitrate concentrations in the Fisher Road area. And the recommendation for consideration is that it be recommended to the board that the Cowichan Valley Regional District continue to collaborate with the Cobble Hill Aquifer Interagency Task Group and property owners to find solutions to address ongoing costs for groundwater monitoring by the property owners of 1345, 1355, and 1360 Fisher Road, and or the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy, but that no funds be expended.
Thank you. I'll first go to Director Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to be speaking against this recommendation, and I request that I be allowed to speak after.
Thank you. I'll go to Director Acton, and I will come back to you then. Director Acton.
So I can speak to it?
Yeah.
But there's no motion.
There is no motion.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, this is an issue that I'm not in favor of the recommended resolution. You know, we heard people from the public give input, and it felt like some really scary foreshadowing of 10 years to, you know, from now. We can have multiple communities saying, you know, we should have been there. And I think everybody here at this table would agree that our community's well-being is our major core value. And so everything that, all our decisions are based around that. And this really feels like we are not taking the responsibility that we could. Because recently, we all know the Auditor General's report says the province isn't doing their job. And we're going to say, well, it's up to the province. Well, they're not doing it, so we need to find a solution. And I appreciate what Mr. Harriet spoke about. CBRD put in the wells, and yeah, and we can say, well, you know, that's an example of where we got ourselves involved, and maybe we shouldn't have. And I disagree with that comment, but I think we do need to finish what was started there. I have been to some of the presentations on the findings. I know I understand as it's not a concern that is growing quickly, so we have time to react properly, but I think we should be reacting, and I would like to have a clear understanding of our watershed function, of what it states that we're putting in wells, and we did in this case as well, and that we should be funding monitoring. And if that is to come out of our South Cowichan funding, 531 function, then maybe that is something to look at. There's other, like Director Nicholson mentioned, there's issues in Mill Bay that could probably be funded through there, and there's issues in Shawnigan Lake that we need to fund monitoring as well. But we just saw that watershed function. Originally, I believed that we were going to do this kind of monitoring with that watershed function. So now that has changed a little bit, and I guess what if we can go around a little bit, I would be willing to have some kind of resolution that we could talk about this at EAS and look at the watershed function and how that could fund these issues that are happening in the South.
Okay, I'm going to go to Mr. Carruthers, but I do want to make a point clear that actually staff did propose in the budget process that we do allocate funding to this, and it was pushed back on at that time, and that it was not included in the budget. And I believe it did come from the South Cowichan was the proposed thing, but I'll give Mr. Carruthers a moment. I do have Director Sebring, and I will come back.
No, I'd like to speak as well.
Well, you did, and then you did say that you were going to let so I will come back to you. I've got Director Sebring and Morrison, and if they want to move you though, but I'm going to go to the CAO for some input before we continue.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And all I wanted to do was just simply provide some context because this has been a somewhat complicated matter. And if you recall, this had come back before the committee around recommendations on moving forward. And I want to articulate that the recommendations that came on May 22nd were from the Cobble Hill Interagency Task Group. They were presented by the CVRD staff, but they were conveying recommendations from the Interagency Task Group. And that Interagency Task Group is made up of representatives from MOE, Ministry of Environment, both regulatory as well as their technical staff, water protection, staff from the Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations who are responsible for water licensing. And we also have 2 members of Island Health. The Public Health Officer, Dr. Shannon Waters, as well as the Drinking Water Protection Officer, sits on that committee. They were involved in this work from day one. We brought them in because it was very clear that this was not an issue that the CVRD could resolve on its own. So those agencies all have responsibilities for various aspects, more notably the Island Health and in terms of the protection of drinking water. The Western Water Report was completed. The Cobble Hill Interagency Task Group sat and reviewed the recommendations and made some very specific recommendations to this group back in May. They included that we do annual sampling of the CVRD's groundwater monitoring wells. That was a recommendation that the group made. They further made a recommendation that we report out every 2 to 5 years on the results of that monitoring of those CVRD wells. And another recommendation was that the Ministry of Environment be approached to take responsibility for the sampling and reporting, primarily because the Ministry of Environment is responsible for enforcing pollution of the environment. They're also currently responsible for governing and overseeing the 2 composting facilities under provincial legislation. And so that came from the Cobble Hill Interagency Task Group that we approached the ministry. The CVRD's expended significant dollars over the years on this, but it was felt that there was a responsibility for a polluter pay approach and for the Ministry of Environment to take responsibility for that. The discussions ensued, and there was some suggestion by Director Wilson that a sizable amount of money be allocated to go and install new monitoring wells and to do a robust monitoring program. And it was referred back to staff to report back, and that's what we're doing here today. The Cobble Hill Interagency Task Group did not recommend installing additional monitoring wells. The technical perspective of all of those people around the table felt that that was not necessary, given that the risks were low, and that given that the potential for the activity on the surface changing, notably more regulation of the composting facilities and the greenhouse being shut down, that we would eventually see improvements to the water condition. Irregardless of that, the recommendations were made to the committee. The staff have now reported back, and at no time have staff said we shouldn't be monitoring those wells. I think the issue is how much money is spent on that and where the funding comes from. The recommendation, and I've, on the board's behalf, have submitted a request to meet with the Deputy Minister of Environment at UBCM with a very deliberate ask that the Ministry of Environment step in and take responsibility for this, for funding this ongoing monitoring, as they've done in other parts of the province. And also to work with local property owners, and I would suggest the improvement districts that have made the offers for funding to work on a collaborative approach to doing the monitoring, ensuring that it's done with the parameters that we require in terms of the sampling that we need. Barring that not being successful, I would expect that we would be back in front of this committee suggesting that we need to be budgeting for doing the monitoring. And at that point in time, this committee is going to have to determine where it wants to fund the funds from, whether it's the Drinking Water and Watershed Protection Service, whether it's the South Cowichan Water Service. Those are decisions that you need to make as a committee. So I just wanted to put that in context, that the recommendations here before you are coming from the Interagency Task Group. And we do support doing ongoing monitoring, but we've also recommended that we approach the Ministry of Environment to take the due responsibility for this matter, because it is not a local government matter, it is very much a provincial government matter.
Thank you. I do have a speakers list here. I just want to, Director Kuhn, did I miss you on this list? Not yet? Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to Director Wilson, then I'll go through the speakers list.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not even going to try and address what the CAO's just said. I attended a meeting in Shawnigan Lake on the subject of contamination recently, and at that meeting, I heard our local MLA, Sonia Furstenau, open with, "Who are we here to serve? First and foremost, the community." That single, very powerful statement is all-encompassing, and it is one that I urge this board to consider seriously while we debate this. I am truly disappointed, truly saddened, that the staff report continues to deny any responsibility to the community and that the CVRD will do nothing. The issue continues to be just brushed aside with the excuses that it's not up to us, it's up to them. We've just heard that just now, whoever them might be. I bring to the attention of this board CVRD bylaw number 4202, Drinking Water and Watershed Protection Service Establishment, which says, the CVRD to annually requisition to the greater of $750 per year, and then it says, within the service area to establish a service for the purpose of drinking water and watershed protection within the Cowichan Valley Regional District. That's pretty clear. The people of Cobble Hill and surrounding areas who rely on Aquifer 197 have endured years of uncertainty with respect to their basic right for a clean and reliable source of potable water supply, and the additional threat of contamination that has been apparent in the Fisher Road area. The CVRD has earlier acknowledged that a problem exists by expending $100,000 to drill 4 test wells, and yet continues to refuse to resume testing or to allow access to those wells for others to sample and analyze. The questions have to be asked. Why the constant resistance, and why the constant deflection of responsibility to others? What is now necessary is to monitor the known nitrate plume. There is no need for additional mass spectrometry to determine the origin of the nitrate, nitrogen, or other extensive testing. One simply needs to monitor for nitrate and nitrite levels as key indicators in the wells as well as the surrounding areas in order to monitor trends. This issue has been and continues to be a key priority for all residents, so let me be clear. This issue will not go away, and of course neither will I. I will not apologize for protecting the well-being of the residents of our Cowichan Valley. I am requesting, in the interest of public health and safety, this board rejects the recommended resolution proposed by staff as it presents not one iota of further or immediate progress. I have a follow-up motion that I'd like to make, and when the time presents itself. Thank you.
Okay, I'll put you on the back end of the speakers list when that time comes. I do want to clarify, though, because during the budget process, there was a recommendation from staff to allocate funding to this, and if I recall correctly, and we could go back, but you had an issue with taking on that cost at that time through the South Cowichan water function.
No, I suggested that we could do that. I didn't have an issue with funding it from there. It was with other areas which had a problem with it. I suggested that we take the money, and I also, if you remember, put forward a formula for actually doing that.
Okay, so you're saying that you supported it, but it was the directors from the other 2 areas that did not.
I'm not. Let me clarify. They weren't too happy about it.
Okay. I'll move through my speakers list. I next have Director Sebring, Morrison, Staples, and then Acton, and then Marsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the things that stood out for me in the public input section was bullet 2 of the handout we received. That the Electoral Area Services Committee had been informed that the Cobble Hill Improvement District would cover the cost of testing the wells at no cost to the CVRD. And the question was asked, rhetorically perhaps, but I'm going to ask it seriously to staff, why would we not accept this offer? What's wrong with having them? I mean, the bottom line that I'm hearing from Director Wilson is we've got to keep doing the testing to make sure that these plumes aren't growing, and if they are, that they don't grow to above acceptable federal levels. And if we have an offer on the table for somebody else to do the test, as long as the testing gets done, is it that we don't trust them? Is there precedents that are at stake here? Why would we not look at that offer?
Through to Mr. Carruthers.
And I think the resolution that's in front of you suggests that we pursue that. All of our resolutions, simply the staff's resolution suggests is that we approach the Ministry of Environment at the recommendation of the Cobble Hill and Interagency Task Group, which includes your Public Health Officer and your Drinking Water Protection Officer, suggested that we approach the Ministry of Environment because the monitoring that would be done would be in accordance with the regulations around those composting facilities, enforceable, and they would be responsible for doing that. Alternatively, it also says that we work with the Cobble Hill Interagency Task Group and the property owners, which I would say to include our improvement districts, to look at funding. So we have not denied that offer. Your technical staff and the Cobble Hill Interagency Task Group have made a recommendation to you in terms of how we recommend it be approached. I have never once said that we would not accept the assistance from Cobble Hill, and I think that needs to be explored as well.
Okay, and I wasn't suggesting you had, I just,
Yeah.
I was paraphrasing the question that was put to us. So we're not turning down that offer? We're saying, let's go to the Environment Ministry first, see if they'll do it, and if not, then we come back here?
That is essentially what.
That's- Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I've got Director Morrison next, then Staples, Acton, and Marsh.
I'll pass for now.
Thank you. Director Staples.
So I think it was just clarified through Director Sebring for me, and then the conversation he just had with Mr. Carruthers. So maybe it's just the wording in this that is making this difficult, and maybe the wording in the recommendation needs to be adjusted so that that there's a stepped process outlined in a recommendation, so that the first thing is to do what was already talked about, that doesn't, and that given, if that does not work out, and I think a time frame is needed as well, like how long do you give the ministry to respond? Is it 3 months, 6 months, a year? So if there's some sort of time frame built in there, that if not, that will come back to the board to arrive at a funding model or, something like that. I think that maybe that's just where the trouble is, because what I heard and what I heard from you were two completely opposite ends of the spectrum. What I heard from the community was that people didn't feel like this was going to be taken seriously or funded or continued on. And from you, I'm hearing that that always has been the plan. We just don't know how that's going to happen. So,
I'll go to, what I'm hearing now, though, is some clarity around those things can happen in tandem, but there is some concern about having MOE standards of testing so that you can actually use that to enforce.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So that was what I was going to suggest, is that staff have always been supportive of the monitoring. We brought forward budget submissions to do the monitoring.
I remember
We
that.
brought forward recommendations in May to do the monitoring, and it was referred back to staff based on an increase or an enhanced level of service of that monitoring. So staff have simply reported back to you. And again, a request has been made to the Ministry of Environment to go and discuss. Director Wilson will be included in that meeting with the Deputy Minister in September. So I think we'll have a pretty good read when we come out of that meeting, whether the Ministry's intention of looking at that or not. I think there's also been discrepancies, and members of the public have been very adamant about disputing the cost estimates of the monitoring. I believe that CVRD staff and the Cobble Hill Interagency Task Group are going to have to reconcile with those offering to do the work what the parameters of that work are, so that the monitoring is done to a standard that will be usable by Island Health and by the Ministry of Environment, and I think we can do that. And that's part of that recommendation is to do that work. So for clarity, we're here back in front of the committee for some direction, and we're suggesting that would be an appropriate step forward, that if we're not able to secure support from the Ministry of Environment, and if we determine that we're not able to, the Cobble Hill Improvement District, their offer doesn't meet the requirements of the Interagency Task Group, that we would be back in front of this committee and saying this is what we would require in order to do the monitoring. I just want to be very clear, the staff have never once not supported doing the ongoing monitoring. It's the degree by which it's done, and it's the installation of new monitoring wells, and it's who pays for it has been the issue. Mm-hmm. We support ongoing monitoring, ongoing analysis of this issue.
Can I just have a quick follow-up
Yep,
to that? So I think that where we're hung up then is that, but no funds be expended on the motion is what I'm feeling is hanging us up to some degree with this, because we're not saying, I think if we can take that out of the recommendation,
Yep.
because from what I've heard and from recalling the conversation that we had around budget time, it's not that we're saying that, so I think that is confusing the issue. We're moving forward, here's the process moving forward, that's what we should be moving right now, and that it comes back to the board once we have an answer from that meeting, and then we move that to the next step.
Thank you. I have next Director Marsh, and then Acton, and then I'll come back to Director Wilson.
Yeah, I really liked what Director Staples said, and it seems like with our public health
I'm trying to,
doctor, Shannon Waters, involved, and all of the, I forget what Mr. Crothers called the group that had the Drinking Water Protection Agency there, and Island Health, and et cetera. It seems like, I don't know, it feels a bit to me like, well, I don't even think I'm going to say that part. I feel confident that the next step is to have Mr. Crothers and Director Wilson meet with the Deputy Minister at UBCM, and that's only right around the corner, and then we can have a report from that. The part of the report that I took great note at was on page, I can't tell if it has a page 3, second paragraph, well, first and second paragraph, talking about the philosophical issue, and if we are going to begin to do things without putting our ducks in a row, in other words, start doing monitoring that should really be done by the province, then where do we stop the line in the region? I mean, if we're going to start saying, let's take this money out of the regional watershed thing, then I suspect we might have other people like North Cowichan, who has to deal with the contamination in Quamachin Lake. And it's going to cost a lot more money than monitoring this. Like, I think that the staff are giving us a careful way to make sure that we don't jump ahead out of a passion and get ourselves into a bind which won't assist us for what we're hoping to do in the long term. So, you know, we can have a report back from Mr. Crothers and Director Wilson shortly after a month from now. So if someone wants to move the motion with the taking out of the expenditure of money, if that seems to be the trigger, I'm just not in a place where I feel like I can formulate a motion, because I'm at a place
I
where I'm
would like to
thinking
just
about my
advise
dog.
that Mr. Crothers is actually trying to capture what's been discussed here in the
Fantastic.
motion.
So-
And to just inject myself for a second, I don't hear any lack of desire on the part of the board at all, or staff, to not monitor these wells. I think what the challenge is, and you highlighted it with the Quamachin issue, is that when you let senior government abdicate their legal responsibility under legislation and take on the financial cost of monitoring a certain well, then the expectation will be that you do elsewhere. So I want to, you know, sort of reflect what I'm hearing clearly so far is definite commitment to ensuring that the wells are monitored. The dispute seems to be around by whom and at whose cost. But I will continue through the speakers list, and then I will come back to Mr. Crothers for maybe a proposed motion that may better reflect. But if Director Wilson, if you will give the consideration to hearing that before proposing your motion, or would you rather have your opportunity first?
Yeah, I would rather have my opportunity first, please.
Okay. I will go to my speakers list. I have a Director Kuhn, and then I believe I will go back to Director Wilson. Oh, sorry, Director Acton. You were next, then Director Kuhn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be quick. I just wanted to say I appreciate with Mr. Crothers' clarity, so that was really helpful. And by attending some of the presentations by the consultants, it's not there's no doubt that there is contamination, but I understood it's not as time urgent. So hearing from the minister and getting everything lined up, I think is a really good strategy. And even if we don't hear by a month, that's fine too. But I think, I like how Director Staples suggested a date. I think a date would be good in there, at least. In my mind, at least we could fund it I would say by next budget season, but.
Okay, thank you. And then I have Director Kuhn.
I'm just wondering if there's already a date set up with the minister to talk about this. Why has that report come forward now? Why didn't we wait with this report till after that meeting? I mean, nothing gets achieved in the meantime. So I wonder, to me, we might as well have waited with this whole report until after the meeting, then we have more facts. Now we're doing what? Now we're saying, oh, okay, we'll have a meeting with the minister and we'll come back again. What a waste of time.
Yeah, if I may, there was a commitment to come back to the committee with a report. I'll let Mr. Carruthers sort of speak to it, but I do want to just say that I think that the statement around maybe the urgency, and we did hear about a history of monitoring and an increase in the nitrate and so I'm going to get it wrong, but the levels over time, the lack of urgency, I think, doesn't provide comfort when you know that this is happening and it's progressing over time. So when community members feel a sense of urgency, it's because there's that uncertainty there. And once there's a program in place that may provide some certainty, that at least takes that urgency and pressure off. Mr. Carruthers, would you like to respond? And then I'm going to go to Director Wilson if he still feels that he's got a better alternative motion.
Sorry, in terms of the report coming forward today?
Yeah, just
I
for
mean,
clarity.
and again, it was certainly a commitment that had been made. I think Director Wilson was quite concerned that this got back in front of the committee. They had been waiting over the course of the summer. It was May that we had met and had been referred back to staff. You know, it doesn't. The residents are concerned. I think to have waited until the end of September, I don't think would have served folks well in terms of, yeah. You know, I mean, I think it's important that we get it out on the table and discuss what the issues are, and you know, staff have made a recommendation around this, and I think there is an avenue to move forward with the community.
And Director Morrison and then Director Wilson.
Thank you. And I appreciate all the commentary to this point. It's important, I think, that the Cobble Hill community needs to know that this is important to this committee and this organization. I'm not wanting to put a whole bunch of stock into the minister meeting at UBCM, because we all know those are very short meetings that you make your pitch, you have your short discussion, and you usually don't get answers. So I think it's important that staff brought this back to committee and that we're having this discussion. But I also, and my apologies to our municipal directors that weren't at the EASC meeting, but we had a presentation by a gentleman who's in the audience who spoke very succinctly to issues around aquifer issues, supply, quality in the Mill Bay area. And I posed the question at the end of his presentation, asking, are you wanting the CVRD to be in the licensing and adjudication of groundwater issues in that area? And it sounds to me there's already community sense that we already play a fairly substantial role in that. And to me, the next step is, if it's already expected by the community that we have a role and we're being asked by the community to play a role. I've heard many discussions around this table about not willingly accepting downloading from the province. But I'm getting a sense that this may be one of those areas where, and quite frankly, I think some of our staff work and data and information is better than the quality of the stuff that's held at the province. But if we're going in this direction, we better be prepared to resource it and resource it properly, because if we're gonna do this, take this on and willingly take a download, we better be prepared to do it well and meet the standards of the community. Thanks.
I'm trying to get to you, Director Wilson, but if somebody wants to speak, Director Sebring, can you make it please as tight as you can?
As tight as I can. During the discussion last year about this entire watershed function, before that ever went to referendum, I made the point as an alternate at this board that said if we want to take on the watershed function, which is a provincial responsibility, surely to God somewhere there's a line item in a provincial budget for monitoring of and work on the Cowichan watershed. If we're going to take the download, we should also insist on the money, and that went nowhere. But that goes directly to Director Morrison's point.
Thank you.
No.
So I know Mr. Carruthers has a motion that would capture the discussion, but I'm going to consider and go with Mr. Wilson. Director
Thank you, Mr.
Wilson.
Chair. I'm glad somebody brought up the issue of if we speak to the minister, we'll have 30 seconds and then nothing's going to be done anyway. And I completely agree with that. And it's great that we've had a meeting arranged. Terrific. And I want to go back to something that was said earlier on by one of the other directors of jumping ahead here. This has been going on for 15 years or longer. How much longer do we want to prevaricate here? It's simple. All I'm asking for is let us test the wells and train and monitor. I don't want to wait until September. Cobble Hill doesn't want to wait until September, because we may not get to where he was. Even if he says, oh, this is terrible, we'll do something about it, it's going to be another year or more. So, and as far as testing of, and the standards of testing, the standards, as far as I know, are universal throughout Canada and throughout BC. And to suggest that the Cobble Hill Improvement District or the Braithwaite Water Improvement District does not adhere to those standards, and that there is a higher standard somewhere that this board or the CVRD wants to adhere to, doesn't make sense to me. So I am going to go ahead and make a motion here before Mr. Carruthers gets in. We have an offer on the table by the Cobble Hill Improvement District to use their fully certified and fully qualified staff in the sampling and analysis of the 4 test wells at zero cost to the CVRD. I move that this committee accepts the Cobble Hill Improvement District offer of testing and reporting of the 4 CVRD test wells twice a year at zero cost, and that all results are made available to the community as a matter of urgency, not in 2 months' time, not in 6 months' time.
Okay,
as
just
soon
keep
as
the motion
possible.
clean. So you had a great motion there, and you can speak to it in a minute. So that motion has been made, and it's been seconded. So now I'll go to discussion on the motion, and then if there is none, I'll call the question. So I'm going to go to Mr. Carruthers if you have any input, and then I'll go to Director Acton.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify statements that were made. At no time were we suggesting that the Cobble Hill Improvement District didn't have the skills to do this monitoring. When we undertook the monitoring regime that we just undertook over the past year, we had a system set up, and I'm not a technical expert, Kate can speak to it, but the Cobble Hill Interagency Task Group specified the parameters that we would be testing. And in order to do long-term monitoring, you have to repeat that. It has to be repeated in the same manner that you did it in the first place in order for the information to be valid. So the estimates that staff have brought forward in terms of the cost of testing that have been disputed by people are reflective of the costs that we paid last time to do it, and they're also reflective of the estimates that we received from Western Water to do this work. They are actual costs. That's what we paid when we had the last round of monitoring done. We would anticipate that if we were to repeat that same monitoring, that's how much we would pay. So I would suggest that if the committee is going to entertain this motion, that we are clear that what Cobble Hill Improvement District is prepared to do for us at no cost is a repeatable monitoring to the same standard that was done before, because if we do it to a different standard, the data is not going to be useful. The interagency task group was very clear on that, that if you're going to do monitoring, it has to be repeatable so that you can gauge differences over time. So I would suggest that if we can meet with the Cobble Hill Interagency Task Group and the Cobble Hill Improvement District, and we can agree on the parameters of that testing and what's required, and they're willing to do that work to the same standard, I would suggest that that's a great opportunity for us to work together. There's been disputes consistently about the cost of our estimates, and I just wanted to be clear on where those estimates came from. They came from how much we have paid to have it done in the past, and we would expect that that's how much we would pay in the future. And I think maybe Mr. Werich might have something as a...
Okay, and I'm going to go there, but I'm just to Mr. Carruthers, to your point, having that, all that said, say this motion passes, and that's exactly what's undertaken.
Yep.
And it's determined with the Cobble Hill Task Group and the Improvement District that that is not something that can be accomplished, then staff would obviously have to come back.
Come back.
Thank you.
Correct.
So I'm going to go to Mr. Warich, and then Director Acton, I believe, is on the speaker's list.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just in addition to what CEO Crothers have just mentioned, so I think we're still discussing one option, that is the monitoring and sampling, who does the monitoring and sampling, and there's always a second portion, that is the interpretation of the report. Since there are several groups involved within this, that is the Ministry of Environment to Fisher Road Recycling to public and, private and public. So the standards, obviously what CEO Crothers is saying, standards have to be the same and consistent to go from past to future monitoring and sampling and interpretation as well. Also, in the past, we've been sampling and monitoring for organic and inorganic signatures because they were confirmed for both of them. One coming from the, potentially coming from the composting facilities, and one from the greenhouse as well. So, when we're considering the cost is not only monitoring and sampling, but also for the interpretation and results. One more thing. The Ministry of Environment under OMAR Organic Matter Recycling Regulation, they have permitted Fisher Road recycling. They've gone through all of the reports that we have submitted, including the ones that we're discussing today. And they have gone back to the Fisher Road recycling, and they asked them to sample at least 2 of those monitoring wells, including one that there is one on site as well. We are negotiating, we're talking to Fisher Road as well, that if they can sample all 4 of them, so that could also be a potential for that. Having said that, nobody's saying the Fisher Road Recycling will do it themselves, because that would not be, again, acceptable, just like because there are so many people involved within this. So, so the idea is to get all the sampling and monitoring done by a third party, and there's a cost of doing monitoring and sampling and reporting.
Thank you. If I may, I would say that I can understand where a community, the professional reliance model, I think we've all heard that around this board enough to know that there's definitely a distrust within the community to have a proponent of a certain project be testing their own waste or potential impact. So although I would be happy to bill them for it, I think that I would be hesitant to allow them to be the ones to contract and conduct that assessment. Remember, we do have a motion on the floor. I'll go to Director Sebring.
Well, this is to the motion and to what we just heard from staff. I mean, it's not just testing, it's also crunching those numbers and determining what they mean and writing the reports. I guess I would ask of Director Wilson, as the mover of the motion, how he envisions that second part happening. And I would ask staff whether that fits and whether that's consistent with what we've done in the past and what that looks like. I mean, forgive me, Mr. Director Wilson, but it's more than just testing we just heard. And how does that come together?
I'll go through to Director Wilson, and then if I can put
Yeah,
myself...
that's it's a good point, actually. And I'm just looking back through what I proposed before when the May 22nd meeting came up, and I did at the time say, okay, fair enough, if it's going to cost this much for testing and monitoring and full spectrum, etc. I did come up with a funding model, and I can read that for you now. It says the 5-year 2019 to 2023 for function 531 has a requisition of $75,000 per annum allocated as follows, and then I've listed the numbers there. And I proposed an initial 5-year funding model for Aquifer 197 for cost sharing between areas A, B, and C. $25,000 per action for function 531 of cost sharing, of which 17,000 would come from Cobble Hill Area C, 2,648 from Area B, 2,648 from Areas A, and the same amount from Area D. So basically, Cobble Hill from function 531 would shoulder the full cost of these things, $25,000 per year. I also asked for an extra $50,000 per annum from the referendum watershed function. Well, if it's going to cost us 10 to 14,000 or 24,000, I've covered it without the 50,000 out of function 531. So let's just get on and do it. The
Okay.
money is there, and we can do the full spectrum. We can do everything. And I understand repeatability. I know all about that stuff. I've been there many times before. We will repeat exactly what has been done before. What we're asking for is access to those wells and to be able to do everything we're supposed to do. One of the other points that's come up, all that testing that was done under a freedom of information, one of my residents asked for all the results, and they were given to him, but they were so redacted that they were useless. There was nothing in there what the location was or anything like that. Somebody has the information, and we're not being allowed to get to it because of privacy concerns, it says. So, 25 grand, it's there, it's already there. Give us the money, let us do the testing, we'll share all the results, and we'll get a third party to do it with that money.
Yeah, and let's just keep on the motion first of all, because, so there's two different issues. So let's just focus on the motion. So, but I get a sense that regardless of some of the more regulatory stuff, and I get that because you don't want to give senior or any level of government an excuse to say, oh, that doesn't comply with our testing procedures or reporting or what have you. So two different issues there. But I think that there was some discussion about having some numbers that the community can see that they can feel more comfortable with, right? And that's what your motion, I think, speaks to. It doesn't preclude still going after the proper channels of funding and so on and so forth. Again, I'm just trying to facilitate finding a solution here. We do have a motion on the floor, and that is to, I'm just going to give anybody a last opportunity to speak on this motion before I call the question. And then if there's any subsequent discussion, we will go from there. So we're going to stay on the motion. Director Toporowski.
Thank you, Chair. Before we vote on it, could it be read back to us again? Thank you.
Our corporate secretary has it, I believe.
Thank you. That the offer from the Cobble Hill Improvement District for twice yearly no-cost sampling and reporting on nitrate concentrations in the Fisher Road area be accepted.
Okay. Director Sebring.
This is an awkward procedural question, and I'm gonna let you rule on it.
Thanks.
I don't feel competent to vote on this motion until I hear what perhaps the alternative motion might be that's going to be put forward by the CAO, because maybe it's better.
So I think that I would go to our, if we tabled this motion, would they be able to hear another one? Or what would the procedure be to hear another alternative motion?
I think at the will of the committee, they could request to hear the input from the CAO because he is not putting a motion on the floor. He's just providing professional advice.
Okay, thank you. I'll allow that. Mr. Carruthers.
Yeah, so, Mr. Chair, it's not much different than what we have been discussing, that the CVRD pursue a meeting with the Ministry of Environment Assistant Deputy Minister. I need to clarify, this is not a meeting with the minister. This is a meeting with senior staff who are in a much better position to make decisions. And that further, that staff engage in discussions with the Cobble Hill Interagency Task Group and local stakeholders, which I'm going to include Cobble Hill Improvement District, with respect to funding ongoing monitoring of the Cobble Hill Aquifer. I think we need to meet and discuss whether or not we can all do this, whether the improvement district is prepared to and has a capability of repeating what we had done earlier. I think it would just be good to have a discussion. We haven't had that conversation. So that was simply my suggestion for a path forward.
Okay, so I'm going to, as the chair, sort of say we've heard that. We do have a motion on the floor, so I think it'd be appropriate to call the question on the motion on the floor, and then we can see if we need to move forward with any alternatives. I'm not seeing any more speakers. I'll call the question then. All those in favor? Opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that motion would be defeated, but please keep your hands up because we need to record, committee, we don't need to record it. Okay, thank you. Director Sebring.
I'd like to move what Brian just read.
Okay, and that's been seconded twice, but I'll go to Director Staples to speak to the motion. Can always amend it.
Yeah, so I think an amendment, and I don't know the wordsmithing on this, but to include reporting back though on that group being able to do what Director Wilson put forward.
So
I
are
just
you,
didn't
you're
hear
asking
that.
for that time? No, but there's no time
no
limit on it. So I think that there's a sense of
yeah.
urgency to make sure that
So
something
that's
comes
what I'm
back.
suggesting, yes.
So, through to Mr. Carruthers, what would be, so you're meeting at UBCM, so would it be the first Regional Services Committee in October that we could get a report back from that meeting and from your meetings with the various groups that are in the motion?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I'd like to think that we could find an opportunity over the month of September to engage in some conversations with the improvement district around what would be required, and that we could be reporting back in October. I had that actually as part of my recommendation that staff report back to the committee with respect to ongoing monitoring activity and costs based on those discussions.
I think the sense I got from Director Staples, and I can sense it from community members though, is to put a date on it. So could we ask for that report for the Regional Services Committee meeting in October? So if someone would move that as an amendment and second it by Director Sebring, is there any more discussion on that motion? I'm going to call the question then. All those in favor? Opposed?
Point of process, don't we need to approve the amendment first, then the
Oh,
motion?
apologies, on the amendment, that was calling the question on the amendment. All those in favor? Opposed? None opposed, and then we'll go back to the main motion as amended.
Thank you.
Even in your weakened state. If we have no speakers on the motion as amended, I'll call the question. All those in favor? I'm getting frazzled. It's almost been 12 hours.
It's been a long day.
I haven't called him doctor or some random name. Mr. Carruthers.
It'd be recommended that the CVRD board pursue a meeting with the Ministry of Environment Assistant Deputy Minister at UBCM, and further that staff engage in discussions with the Cobble Hill Interagency Task Group and local stakeholders with respect to funding ongoing monitoring of the Cobble Hill Aquifer, and that staff report back to the committee, and I'll add in October, with respect to ongoing monitoring activity and costs.
Okay, so now I'll call on the motion as amended. All those in favor? Opposed? None opposed. Motion carries. Thank you very much. All right, Ms. Legault. I know you're feverishly writing, but Mr. Carruthers has written it out for you.
Thank you. So item R4 is a report from the Recycling and Waste Management Division regarding letters to the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy on Recycling and Waste Management. And the recommendation before you is that it be recommended to the board that 2 letters be sent to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Strategy as follows. 1, to provide feedback on the Plastics Action Plan Policy Consultation Paper for proposed amendments to the BC Recycling Regulations, and 2, to request further amendments to the BC Recycling Regulation as identified in the staff report to the August 28th, 2019 Regional Services Committee.
Moved by Director Yanni DiNardo, seconded by Director Marsh. Discussion. Seeing none. Oh, Director Nicholson.
I was just wondering about the recommendation that we move to a 10-year recycling plan idea. And I guess I'm wondering about that because it seems that recycling, that whole recycling market, and things change a lot in recycling, and I guess that's a problem for managing it, but it seems like we need to be flexible, so I'm not sure if it's practical to move to a 10-year recycling plan, and maybe staff could speak to that.
I'll put it through to staff. Mr. Warch.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am not too sure if I understood the question, but I think the question is that why we're suggesting that they should go to 10 years plan and.
In such a dynamic situation around recycling.
So in our last meeting with Recycle BC, when I attended there and I asked that question, because every time with a stroke of the pen, they can change anything and they can say this is included, that's not included, or that's excluded from putting into bins. It's very confusing to educate the public and public to actually get onto the new program as quickly. So one of the suggestions that is that because our solid waste management plans, they're for 10 years, they're not for 5 years. So why don't we make some sort of, whatever the changes they want to make it for 10 years so that we can follow that for the longer term, not for the short term.
Thank you. I'm not sensing the same sense of clarity. I don't have it either, so.
Well, I mean, I understand that, but
You're talking about the reality of the
the
world we live
reality
in.
of it is, if they can't sell, plastic bottles to be recycled anymore, but we continue to collect them and they build up at Recycle BC, it doesn't work for anyone. So I just kind of wonder if we're being unrealistic, that was all.
Thank you. Mr. Warch.
So thank you again for the question. I think that's a very valid question, and I think all of us have been asking this question because BC is still positioned well because of Recycle BC and because of the EPR. I know of one of the municipality in Alberta. They have reversed their decision to go for recycling. They're actually not recycling anymore. This is the first I've heard in decades. It's because they don't find markets. So now BC does have contracts in place. So I think we're putting pressure on BC government to find more solutions locally for circular economy and find the resources as well as the solutions. So where it goes hand in hand from federal to provincial to local government is federal is also trying to make some decisions on plastic and quite drastic changes as well, hoping by 2021. And BC has to follow that in a very quick term. And I think so BC is sort of sandwiched in between because federal is now coming from the other end and saying we can make these policies. All the local governments, they want to have zero waste policies. They want to go with, minimizing their recycling and organics and whatnot. But, the finding solutions is one thing. But I think all this is asking for is having to find long-term solutions and whether they're international or within their own municipalities or, just to promote the circular economy.
Okay, I understand it better. Thank you for such a concise answer. Mr. Director Sebring and then Director Kuhn.
Thank you. I'm going to throw a monkey wrench into this a little bit. We, as a board, a little while ago, authorized throwing some money at looking at what they're doing in Halifax, which is waste to energy. I've spoken to some of the proponents, and I'm not a proponent for waste to energy, but if we're going to look at it, let's look at it. And we need to keep in mind as a board that if that's a direction that we want to go in 3 or 4 years, it's a complete mind blower because it's a mind shift because the best, most efficient source of energy that you can get out of waste is plastic milk bottles. So now we're not recycling, we're doing something completely different with them. And I just want to kind of throw that out there as another way to think about this. I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. I'm glad I didn't see a bunch of hands go up, but good consideration for the future. Director Kuhn.
Yeah, with regard to plastic bottles and bottles, period, it's one of my pet peeves. Why don't we, and I wonder if we as a CVRD could do something like that, make a recommendation to the ministry. All we'd have to do is increase the deposit. like they've done in Europe. In Germany, the deposit for plastic bottles is between 15 and 30 euro cents. You don't see any wasted bottles anywhere.
Well, and to speak to that, actually in the survey, a specific section of questions is about increasing deposits. So the ministry is indeed thinking about it.
Good, yeah, because that would eliminate it.
Okay, thank you. Director Morrison.
Just in support of the contents of the recommended input to the provincial government, as sitting with the AVICC Solid Waste Task Force, and I think Director Yanni DiNardo sits there for us now. One of the things that was a bit of an issue was the fact that there wasn't consistency in timelines for we're doing a solid waste plan, we've just done one, another group is doing theirs, and what we were trying to approach from an island perspective or coastal communities perspective was having consistency in regulation so that we're all working from a level playing field and trying to do the same thing so that we weren't having people going next door to bring a product that was cheap or free to a neighboring jurisdiction. So this does make sense if we're going to try and have input, that we have input that's consistent. And I can see how if we're all mandated to have 10-year solid waste management plans, it's probably a good idea for the province to be doing similar things so that there's some consistency in our planning.
Thank you. Sorry, I had to quelch a yawn there. Anyone else? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? None opposed, motion carries. Ms. Legault, it took me a minute to remember names, I'm sorry.
Item R5, excuse me, is a report from the Recycling and Waste Management Division regarding CVRD odor complaint management system under CVRD bylaw number 2570, Waste Stream Management Licensing Bylaw 2004, and it's for information.
Thank you. So we have that report for information. Are there any questions at this time? Seeing none, Ms. Legault, I think we move on to question period.
Correct.
Question period. Please, I will be slow to respond, but I will promise to respond. Mr. Harriet, welcome.
I just wondering is asking for clarification considered a question, or do you have to?
No, I'll do my best.
Okay, so it's to,
It's always to the chair.
to the
Yes.
chair.
Policy
through the
is that we
chair
do not
to-
go,
to-
no, it doesn't work that
Oh,
way.
okay, to the
I will do
chair.
my best to answer, and staff will usually bark at me if I'm wrong.
Earlier in the proceedings, Mr. Carruthers stated that the CVRD has never once refused to test the wells at Fisher Road. I'm wondering if he could clarify for me, given that they refused to test the wells between fall of 2014 and the spring of 2018, a period of 3.5 years.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to not be able to answer that question. These are questions to the board chair.
Okay.
On behalf of the board. If I may, I would just suggest that I think you heard very clearly, I think it was indicated by the board, I'm only speaking for myself, I can't speak for other board members, but a willingness to make sure that the people of Cobble Hill feel supported on this issue however we can. So that's this board. You know, having a smug response or mocking.
This
No,
isn't meant to be a
No, I know,
smug
but what I'm
response.
saying
It's a
is,
question.
this board can't reflect back on previous decisions.
It's
We
just
can
a-
just say going forward, I think you should
But I
see
heard a
some
statement
support.
that didn't make sense.
Okay, I appreciate
and
that, but
didn't align with what happened.
I don't think I can provide you the answer that you're asking for. Nothing? Okay, so then I'm going to ask for a motion to resolve, actually to adjourn this meeting, but that's board. We still have to close, thank you. Motion to adjourn, Director Yanni DiNardo, Director Sebring, all those in favor? Opposed, and board members, we do have to reconvene closed session of board. We'll give about 5 minutes, because that means 10.